Welcome back to Occult Archives. You know how this works. We dig into those books shrouded in mystery, myths, and legends. And today, we're cracking open one that's especially mind-bending.
Buckle up.
We're going deep on C.W. Leadbeater and his exploration of, well, clairvoyance.
Clairvoyance Unveiled. The multidimensional mechanics of psychic sight. Trying to say that 5 times fast.
Forget that. We're diving in, figuring out what Leadbeater believed about clairvoyance, and maybe, just maybe, how it could even work for us regular folks.
That's right. We're talking different planes of existence, the nature of perception. Consider this your crash course, with some unexpected twists and turns on a topic that can feel, well, overwhelming.
For sure. I mean, clairvoyance, for a lot of people, it sounds like something out there, right? Some magical ability totally separate from our daily lives. But Leadbeater, he suggests that it might actually be connected to the way we already experience the world.
Absolutely. He kicks things off by saying clairvoyance isn't like this bizarre alien power. He argues it's more like an extension of powers we all have and use all the time. And to illustrate this, he talks about vibrations, specifically vibrations in the air and in something he calls the ether.
Ah, the ether. So walk us through this air and ether analogy. What's Leadbeater getting at here?
Okay, so picture this. We're swimming in a sea of air and ether being like this finer substance that's everywhere, even inside solid objects. And both of these carry vibrations, which are essentially information coming from the world around us.
Information we pick up with our senses, right? Like seeing and hearing.
Exactly, our eyes. They're tuned into a teeny tiny range of vibrations in the ether that we call light. That's what we see. Same with our ears. They pick up a small slice of vibrations in the air, and we experience that as sound. But here's the kicker. Even back then, science already knew that there are tons of vibrations, both higher and lower, than what our senses can pick up.
Like, what are those, actinic rays and those high-pitched sounds bats make?
Precisely. Actinic and heat rays. Those are types of light we can't see. And the ultrasonic squeaks of bats, we can't hear those either.
Makes you realize how much we're missing, right? Like, we're just experiencing a tiny fraction of what's actually out there.
Exactly. And Leadbeater doesn't stop there. He points out that even within those normal ranges we can see and hear, people have different levels of sensitivity. For example, you know how a prism splits light into a rainbow?
Yeah, sure.
Well, if you had a bunch of people look at that rainbow and mark where they see the edges of each color, you get different answers. Some might see the violet extending further than others. Some might see more red.
Oh, interesting.
Same with hearing. Some folks can pick up those super high-pitched sounds, others can't.
Right, like those dog whistles. So what's he saying here? What's the takeaway for us?
He's suggesting that, well, this variation, this difference in how much we can already perceive, it hints that the potential to perceive even more is already within us. That the ability to respond to a wider range of vibrations, to be clairvoyant, in other words, it's not something totally foreign.
It's like some of us are just a little bit more tuned in already. Okay, so clairvoyance, maybe not as far-fetched as it seems. But then Leadbeater goes on to categorize different types of clairvoyance based on these vibrational levels, and something he calls the planes of consciousness. Can you break that down for us?
You bet. He talks about etheric clairvoyance, astral clairvoyance, and then something called Buddhic clairvoyance. But right off the bat, he makes it clear that what we usually think of as ordinary clairvoyance, it generally doesn't involve that Buddhic plane. That's like a whole other level.
So we're mainly dealing with etheric and astral then.
Right. And here's another key idea. Leadbeater says that every physical object has a counterpart, you could say, on the astral plane. It's not separate, but like another aspect of the same thing, vibrating at a different frequency.
Yeah.
He describes astral matter as less dense than physical matter.
Okay, so different planes, different densities. Let's dive into the simple clairvoyance, starting with what Leadbeater calls full etheric vision. What does that look like?
Think of it as a heightened sensitivity to physical vibrations, but just beyond what we normally see and hear. One of the coolest things, according to Leadbeater, is that with full etheric vision, inanimate objects start to look almost transparent.
Ah, so this is where we get the seeing through walls thing.
Yep, that's etheric vision. Leadbeater says someone with this ability could easily see through walls like they were a light mist. They can tell you what's in the next room or even what's hidden inside a locked box. You could even read a sealed letter that way.
Chant Andy, what about a closed book? Could you read that with etheric vision? He mentions that's trickier.
It is. Technically, you could see through the pages. They become sort of see-through. But you'd be seeing all the pages at once, all jumbled together, because it'd be overlapping. Deciphering the text would be, well, pretty much impossible.
So not quite as convenient for cheating on exams, then. What else changes with full etheric vision?
Colors, for one thing. Leadbeater suggests that you'd start seeing totally new colors, shades we don't even have names for because they're beyond our normal spectrum. Plus, even familiar colors on objects might look different. You'd see subtle variations that we normally miss. Two things that look the same color to us might look very different to someone with etheric vision because of these new colors mixed in.
Wow. So it's like seeing the physical world, but with like super senses, X-ray vision, and a whole new palette of colors.
Exactly. Now let's jump to full astral vision. This one is a bit more radical. Leadbeater describes it as perceiving things from, like, a whole new dimension. To explain this one, he uses this great analogy of a wooden cube with writing on it.
Yeah, I remember that one. Can you walk us through it again?
So imagine a wooden cube with writing on every side, top, bottom, all four sides. If you looked at it with etheric vision, it'd be like the cube was made of glass. You could see through it, but the writing on the far side would be backwards, and the writing on the sides would be hard to make out because you'd be looking at it edge on. You'd still be limited by your perspective in a way.
Got it.
So,
So what about astral vision? How's that different?
astral vision, you'd see all six sides of the cube at the same time, all the writing right side up, as if the entire cube was flattened out in front of you. And you'd see the inside too, not by looking through the wood, but like it was all laid out flat, nothing obscured. Leadbeater's point is that you're looking from a totally new direction, like at a right angle to all the dimensions we're used to.
It's like the limitations of 3D space just disappear.
Exactly. He uses another example looking at the back of a watch. Etherically, you'd see the gears through the back and the watch face through the gears all backwards. But astrally, you'd see the watch face the right way up and all the individual parts laid out separately, with nothing blocking anything else.
So depth, the idea that things are blocking other things, that doesn't really apply on the astral plane, does it?
Nope. How thick something is, how far away it is, that matters with etheric vision. But with astral vision, those physical barriers don't intervene, as Leadbeater puts it. And this leads him to the concept of the fourth dimension.
Ah, yes, the fourth dimension. Always a tough one to wrap your head around. How does he connect that to astral vision?
He suggests that, well, the way astral vision lets you see all sides of an object at once without perspective getting in the way, that's kind of what seeing from a fourth dimensional viewpoint would be like. He even brings up C.H. Hinton, this guy who tried to explain and visualize four-dimensional figures. Leadbeater himself says that the tesseract, that four-dimensional cube Hinton described, is a familiar form on the astral plane.
And what about Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky? I remember Leadbeater mentions a slight difference in how she saw the fourth dimension.
Yeah, he brings her up. Blavatsky had this idea that, well, the fourth dimension was just a way of talking about how permeable matter is, how you can, in a way, see through it. Leadbeater respectfully disagrees. He says, sure, that permeability idea that describes etheric vision perfectly seeing through things, but astral vision, that's different. It's about seeing from a totally different perspective, like Hinton described.
Gotcha. So etheric is like an extension of our 3D senses, and astral hints at something beyond our usual ideas about dimensions. Now, something else people associate with clairvoyance is seeing auras, those colorful energies around people. Where does that fit into Leadbeater's framework?
Seeing the aura, specifically the emanations coming from the astral body, that falls squarely under astral clairvoyance. Someone with this ability, when they look at a person, they see them surrounded by these luminous mists. That's the astral aura. And those mists are filled with all sorts of colors, constantly shifting and changing in brightness.
And those colors, they're not random, right? Leadbeater assigns specific meanings to them.
Right. He gives you this whole color key, like a beautiful rose color. That's pure affection. Deep blue means devotion. And the negative emotions have colors too. A dull brown for selfishness, scarlet for anger, a lurid red for, well, sensuality, livid gray for fear, and then black clouds for hatred and malice. He says a skilled clairvoyant can read these colors like a book, instantly knowing someone's true feelings.
So it's like wearing your heart on your sleeve, but literally in a visible spectrum. He also talks about how the overall mix of colors in the aura, when it's relatively stable, can tell you about a person's deeper character too.
Exactly. He says the astral body, and therefore its aura, is a reflection of a big part of who a person is on that plane. So you can look at the dominant colors, how they interact, and get insight into their general tendencies, their disposition.
And it's not just emotions, right? What about those thought forms he talks about?
Ah, yes. The thought forms. Emotions create colors in the aura, but thoughts, they radiate out as these distinct thought forms, and those can be visible to an astral clairvoyant, too. It's another way to glimpse into someone's mental landscape, what they're actively thinking, what's going on in their mind. He even mentions these illustrations in an article by Annie Besant in the journal Lucifer to give you an idea of what they might look like.
So astral clairvoyance, it's a window into emotions and thoughts that are normally hidden from view. But beyond seeing auras and thought forms around people, Leadbeater also describes this whole astral world. What's that about?
So with astral vision, you can perceive this whole other plane of existence, and it's not empty. He talks about seeing what he calls the ceaseless tide of elemental essence, which is like this ever-shifting, almost fluid-like substance. Then there are nature spirits connected to the natural world, and then these evolving beings called divas, which he compares to angels.
Sounds like a whole ecosystem of beings we normally don't see.
It is. But what's maybe even more interesting is that you can see the human inhabitants of the astral world too. Leadbeater divides them into two groups, those we call living, whose astral bodies are active when they're asleep, and those we call dead, who have left their physical bodies behind entirely.
And he makes this point that death, well, it's not this huge dramatic transformation that we often imagine, right?
Exactly. He says that dying doesn't fundamentally change who you are, your consciousness. The day after you die, you're basically the same person, same personality, same good and bad qualities, just without the physical body. He compares it to taking off a coat.
So the astral world is populated by, well, people we might know, just in a different form.
Precisely. And because clairvoyants can not only see these folks but communicate with them, Leadbeater suggests that they could be a huge help to those who have recently passed. He says a lot of people are confused or even distressed because what they find after death isn't what they were taught, especially in Western religions. A clairvoyant who understands the astral world can provide some much-needed guidance.
It's a perspective on death that's less final, more like a transition to a different state. Now, Leadbeater also talks about what he calls partial manifestations of simple clairvoyance. What are those?
He's basically saying that, well, most untrained clairvoyants, it's not this perfect, fully controlled vision. It's more often fragmented. It can vary in how strong it is, what types of things are seen, how consistently it happens, how detailed it is.
So you might catch a glimpse of something but not be able to control it.
Exactly. He gives this interesting example of a friend of his who could constantly see atomic ether and atomic astral matter, which is like the superfine building blocks of those planes. This person could see the structure of these things everywhere, but they rarely saw beings made of the lower ethers or the denser astral matter. It's like they had this very specific, almost niche kind of higher sight, not the whole spectrum.
Interesting. And he also briefly mentioned this idea of mesmeric trance as a way to temporarily unlock clairvoyant abilities in some people.
Yeah, he touches on that. He says some people, they might have a sensitive psychic nature, but their everyday awareness, their waking consciousness, it's just too caught up in the physical world for these abilities to really surface. But a mesmeric trance, by kind of putting those outer senses on hold, it can free the consciousness and allow those clairvoyant faculties to work, at least to some extent.
So it's like you quiet down all the noise of the physical world so you can hear a fainter signal. Okay, now let's talk about clairvoyance in space, which Leadbeater calls traveling sight. He splits this into two types, intentional and unintentional. Let's start with intentional clairvoyance. What's he talking about there?
Intentional clairvoyance, this is what a fully developed astral clairvoyant can do. They can literally direct their sight to anywhere on the planet. They can either project their astral body to the place they want to see or just extend their perception there. And because astral vision bypasses physical stuff, nothing is off limits. Even the most secret places are open to them.
It's like remote viewing. He also mentions this idea of radiations carrying images across distances. What's that about?
Yeah, there was this idea floating around back then, what he calls an ingenious hypothesis. Basically, the idea is that objects are always sending out radiations in every direction, kind of like light waves, but carrying their image. So a clairvoyant could pick up those radiations and see the object. Now, how exactly that would work, well, that's up for debate. But the point is, there might be these subtle energies transmitting visual information across space.
Fascinating. So what's it like actually seeing a distant event with this kind of intentional clairvoyance?
Leadbeater says it would appear life-size, right there in front of you, not tiny and far away. And you could shift your perspective, look around the scene. Interestingly, he says that clairaudience, psychic hearing, that might not be as common with this type of clairvoyance. Instead, you might just mentally understand what the people involved are thinking and intending.
So it's not just seeing, it's like a telepathic understanding of the situation too. He also says that staying focused is super important for this type of vision.
Oh yeah, definitely. Your consciousness is still tied to your physical body, so if you lose concentration, poof, the vision is gone. You have to refocus to bring it back.
And he says the astral body can be used for traveling sight too, right?
Yep. Being able to project your astral body and move it around, that opens up a whole new level of freedom. You can travel to distant places super fast, even find places on a map without ever having been there or even knowing anything about them. You can even go up and get a bird's eye view of a whole region.
It's like an invisible, instant form of travel just for observation. He tells that story about the seer from Philadelphia who could remotely view events. That's a good example of this, right?
It is. The story goes, this guy, he was asked by a ship captain's wife to check on her husband who was in London, and the seer was able to see him sitting in a coffee house and report back on how he was doing.
Amazing. And I remember Leadbeater mentioned something about the Theosophical Society having rules against publicly proving these kinds of abilities. Why was that?
He explains that there was this understanding within the Theosophical Society that, well, you shouldn't go around proving these powers to outsiders. The focus was on inner development, not on making a spectacle of yourself. He says there was this brief period where they relaxed that rule and it didn't end well for them.
So it was about inner work, not about showing off. Okay, let's shift gears to what Leadbeater calls unintentional clairvoyance in space. What are some examples of that?
Unintentional clairvoyance, this is when those perceptive abilities just kind of pop up. You don't choose to do it. One type is spontaneous astral travel during sleep. Leadbeater suggests that people can, without realizing it, travel in their astral bodies to places they care about or are interested in and witness things happening there.
Like those stories about mothers who are dying, visiting their children who are far away.
Exactly. He mentions stories from Dr. F.G. Lee and a story about a woman named Mary Goff. These dying mothers, they have this powerful urge to see their children, and they end up appearing to them, even though they're miles apart. Sometimes multiple people even see them. It suggests that strong emotions can propel the astral body, even when the physical body is unconscious.
And then there's crystal gazing. How does that work?
Crystal gazing, that's using those polished surfaces, like crystal balls, mirrors, even bowls of water, to induce visions. These visions, they're often of things that seem totally unimportant, but they can be incredibly detailed. Leadbeater quotes examples from Andrew Lang, like a woman who saw a very specific red sofa in a vision, and then later, when she visited a certain house, there it was. Or a man who saw a woman he knew under a lamp and accurately described what she was wearing and who she was with at that exact time and place.
It's fascinating how mundane yet accurate those visions can be. It suggests that those polished surfaces are acting like a trigger, bringing out an ability that's already there, but dormant.
Exactly. And the visions can also be more like romantic or symbolic, showing you unknown people or places.
Okay, so crystal gazing, spontaneous astral travel. He also mentions waking visions and vivid dreams as ways to glimpse this superphysical reality. What about those astral currents he talks about?
Right, the astral currents. He suggests that in those cases, and in others, your sight might be using this, like energetic link between people, often formed unintentionally, just by thinking about someone strongly or having a strong emotional connection with them.
He tells that story about Mrs. Broughton seeing the Duke of Orzin's accident just because her doctor friend, who was treating him, was constantly thinking of her.
That's a great example. It shows how a powerful connection, even if you're not aware of it, can create this link, and you end up seeing what the other person is experiencing. He mentions another case, too. General R's wife, she saw him getting wounded in battle at the exact moment it happened, likely because of their strong love for each other.
Wow. And then there are those completely random visions, the ones that seem to have no purpose at all.
Oh, yeah, he talks about those, too. Just random clairvoyant pictures, no clear cause, no meaning that you can discern. Like Demi, Mr. Stead, he had these vivid scenes of a seaside town in a reading room that would just pop into his head before he fell asleep. Leadbeater's point is that even though they might seem insignificant, those little glimpses can be enough to convince you that clairvoyance is real.
It's like peeking behind the curtain for a second. Now let's shift from seeing across space to seeing across time. Leadbeater talks about clairvoyance into the past reading the Akashic records. This is like a core concept in Theosophy, right?
It is. He says that these detailed visions of the past, they're actually read from these Akashic records. And he clarifies that they're not in the astral light, as some folks thought before. They're on the mental plane.
So what about those reflections of the past on the astral plane? They're not as accurate.
Right. He says also like reflections on choppy water, fragmented, distorted. The akasha, which is the matter of the mental plane, that's where the records are clear and complete. But he does say that to fully understand these records, we need abilities far beyond what humans currently have. What we can grasp is limited.
And he ties this into the formation of the solar system. He talks about the nebular hypothesis, but with a twist.
Yeah, occult science, it agrees with the physical explanation of how the solar system formed from a nebula, but it adds this idea that the Logos, the being who created our system, he first conceived of the whole thing on a higher mental plane, a realm we can barely comprehend, before it actually manifested physically. So the physical evolution is like a descent from that pre-existing blueprint.
And these Akashic records, they're basically the memory of this Logos, right?
That's the idea. Our whole solar system, it exists within the consciousness of the Logos, so the true record of everything that's ever happened, it's ultimately his memory. What we can access are reflections of that memory in the denser matter of the lower planes. And the most accurate reflection, that's on the mental plane.
So if different clairvoyants looked at those mental plane records, they'd see the same thing.
Yeah, the reflection on the mental plane, it would be consistent. But translating those impressions into our language, our understanding, that's where things get tricky. It's like an artist trying to paint a 3D scene on a 2D canvas. Leadbeater emphasizes that this is why it's so important to be careful to verify what clairvoyants are saying, because their interpretation can get mixed in.
Sounds like accessing these records might involve tapping into dimensions beyond the three we're used to, maybe even a fifth dimension.
He suggests that, yeah, the experience on the mental plane might be similar to navigating a fifth dimension. And on the Buddhic plane, he says time and space, those limitations dissolve completely. Past, present, and future, they all exist at once. He uses this analogy from a book called The Stars and the Earth, about how the speed of light affects how we perceive time. He says our idea of time as linear, as a straight line, might be a limitation of our perspective.
Right. And the appearance of the records themselves, that seems to depend on which plane you're accessing them from, right?
Yeah. On the astral plane, they often appear as simple pictures or moving scenes like little movies. On the mental plane, they can be like a backdrop of living photographs. But when a trained clairvoyant focuses on a specific event, it's different. They're not just watching a picture anymore. They're immersed in the scene. They can experience the sights and sounds, even the thoughts of the people involved, as if they were right there.
But they can't interact with the past.
No interaction. You're just observing.
Like a ghost at a historical reenactment.
Exactly. And the ability to read the Akashic records, it opens up all sorts of possibilities for research, for understanding history. You could correct inaccuracies, study ancient cultures, even see prehistoric life. You could even relive your own past lives as a spectator.
And how do clairvoyants date events in these records?
Leadbeater gives a few methods. One is by running through the timeline quickly and using known dates as reference points, like the sinking of Atlantis. Another is by using astronomical markers, like precession of the equinoxes, how the pole star changes over time. Those can help date super ancient events.
It's like a vast library of all of history, accessible to those with the right skills. What about clairvoyance into the future, what he calls prevision? That's even harder to wrap your head around, right?
It is. We can kind of get our minds around the idea that the past is still out there in some form, but the future already existing, that's a tougher pill to swallow. But Leadbeater, he acknowledges that there's solid evidence for prevision, even if some of the things people see seem trivial.
Like that Scottish second sight example where they predicted who the pallbearers at a funeral would be, even when someone tried to change it. That always blows my mind.
It is wild.
Yeah.
But Leadbeater says it's not really predestination. It's more about understanding cause and effect on a deeper level, particularly on the mental plane. From that perspective, you can see how actions have far-reaching consequences and how different causal chains interact.
So the future, it exists as a set of probabilities based on what's happening now.
Right. But then you've got human free will, and that introduces uncertainty, especially with people who are more developed, whose choices are harder to predict. On the mental plane, Leadbeater says, you can see these points of new departure, moments where a choice is made, and from those points, multiple potential futures branch out. Now, a highly evolved being, they might be able to see which choice will be made every time.
He quotes this passage from Dreams and Ghosts about how time is relative. The idea that the past and future might actually coexist.
Yeah, he uses this analogy of a cone passing through a flat plane. It's a way to visualize how a multidimensional reality where past, present, and future are all there at once, how that could appear as a sequence, a timeline to us, because we're stuck in 3 dimensions. On the Buddhic plane, you can see the whole cone, so to speak.
And prevision, it comes in different flavors, from vague feelings to what he calls second sight.
Right. Second sight that's often associated with the Scottish Highlanders, and it seems to be focused on bad stuff, especially death. He says it often involves symbolic images like shrouds or these corpse candles, and it can be hereditary or linked to specific places. He tells this intense story about a guy, Mr. Cameron, who had a second sight vision of his commanding officer dying in very specific detail.
Creepy. What about those cases of prevision in dreams or waking visions?
Those happen too. Sometimes they act as warnings. Sometimes they show you seemingly random events, like a woman had a dream about a specific tramp 7 years before she actually encountered him. Or a mother who had a vision of her child's hospital room right down to the white nightgown before the kid even had surgery.
Crazy. And then you've got those cases of prevision that seem totally pointless, like seeing something that happens a few minutes later.
Right. He mentions a woman who saw a dog cart in a vision, and then half an hour later, that exact dog cart drove by.
So random. And he says these premonitions, they can come from different sources, from your own higher self, or even from some outside entity.
Yeah. And then there are those, well, those are really out there, the spectral armies and those phantom flocks of animals.
What are those all about?
These are rare cases where people see large groups of, like, ghostly soldiers or animals, often in the same location, sometimes over many years. And these apparitions, they often do things that would be impossible physically, like marching through solid rock. He gives a bunch of possible explanations, mirages, though he doesn't think that covers all of them. Then large-scale prevision, reflections from the Akashic records, nature spirits messing with us, or even like echoes of past events that are so charged with emotion that they get replayed. He talks about the Battle of Edge Hill, how there were all these reports of seeing ghostly reenactments of the battle years later.
So time, it's not just this neat straight line. It's more fluid, more layered, with the past and future sometimes bleeding into our present.
Definitely makes you think.
Now, Leadbeater, he briefly touches on ways to develop clairvoyance, although he says that wasn't his main focus in these writings. What does he say about that?
He's very clear that real development, it requires moral and mental growth, and ideally, guidance from a master, someone from what he calls the Great White Brotherhood. He's not a fan of those quick fix methods, those ads you see for clairvoyance classes, or what he calls developing circles. Meditation, done regularly and with the right intention, focusing on higher spiritual ideals, that's what he recommends. He says that can help cultivate true clairvoyance.
And he ends by talking about the responsibility that comes with clairvoyance, right?
Huge point. Clairvoyance, it gives you access to incredible knowledge. It lets you help others in ways you couldn't imagine. But it can also be a burden, seeing all the suffering in the world. He quotes Schiller, who talks about how horrifying it could be to see clearly. But Leadbeater says that feeling passes as you develop higher sight, as you start to see the bigger picture, the purpose behind things. And he's very clear that using clairvoyance for selfish gain, that's a big no-no, with some seriously bad karmic consequences.
He also addresses the privacy concerns, right? Like, if people can see into our minds, what's stopping them from snooping?
He makes it very clear that trained clairvoyants, they have strict rules against prying, against using their abilities for personal gain or for showing off to skeptics. Their focus is on helping others and on their own spiritual growth. And he says those who are truly advanced, they're not interested in our little secrets anyway. They've got bigger fish to fry.
And he envisions a future where humanity as a whole develops higher clairvoyance, right?
Yeah, he paints this picture of a world transformed. Direct access to knowledge and truth becomes the norm. History, science, medicine, philosophy, work, education, religion, everything changes. And those who are evolved, they can help each other in ways we can't even imagine now. But he also warns that for this to work, for it not to backfire, we need a corresponding increase in morality and wisdom. Otherwise, we might just repeat the mistakes of past civilizations, like Atlantis, who had these abilities but misused them.
So, Leadbeater's take on clairvoyance, it's not just about seeing. It's woven into the fabric of reality, the nature of vibration, how consciousness works across multiple planes. From those everyday senses to the potential to read the records of time, it's mind-blowing stuff.
Totally, and it raises so many questions.
It does. What about you? What stood out to you in all of this? What are you still pondering? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Keep those questions burning. And until our next deep dive into the Occult Archives, as always, stay curious.
And keep an open mind.